Danielle Smith is the new Premier of Alberta, and there was a little bit of controversy surrounding one of her first media avails press conferences since becoming the new leader of the UCP. Smith called unvaccinated people the most discriminated against group that she's witnessed in her lifetime. Now, to chat about this in a little more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who joins us once again from Edmonton. Tyler, many who remain unvaxxed agree with the Premier. They're saying, yeah, go Danielle. But then other groups such as our First Nations are saying, hey, what about us?
Yeah, didn't make it very long into being premier before there was a little bit of controversy, that's for sure. The New Democrats obviously have absolutely pounced on this over the last little bit here and talking about it pretty much constantly. A Jewish organization in Edmonton has reached out to the Premier's office to express its concerns and sort of revisit the need for Holocaust education in the province and things like that. So obviously Danielle Smith rode a wave to power that was in large part sort of fueled by the sentiment of the unvaccinated and concerns over how the unvaccinated were treated. But this, I think, is fairly clearly an early sort of misstep. Obviously, there are people who agree with her, people who disagree with her, but I don't know if that's exactly how a person wants to start their very first day as premier, sort of on the back foot a little bit over some of these comments. So we'll have to see how this shakes out. We'll have to see if there's an apology. We'll have to see if she clarifies these remarks in the days ahead. But a bit of a starting out with a bang, I guess you could say, in her tenure as premier.
Now, Danielle Smith says her party is united as the UCP prepares for the next provincial election in the spring. Tyler, do you think she'll still move forward with the Alberta Sovereignty Act or maybe kind of back off a little bit?
Well, that's a really good question because it actually seemed when she was talking to reporters on Tuesday that she was backing off a little bit. She did say that Supreme Court decisions would be respected, which is certainly not the sort of tone that she had struck over the last few months on the campaign trail. So I think we'll very much have to see what comes of that. This was the other, this was sort of a two-sided wave that brought her to the Premier's office, was the vaccine thing and the treatment of Alberta by Ottawa thing. So if she softens her stance on this, if she backs off on this policy that a lot of the party base really, really liked, she's going to find herself potentially in a similar position that Jason Kenney did. So at this point, the signal seems to be that she's softening her stance a little bit. But of course, she has said in recent weeks that she was going to have to, consult with caucus on how to make it happen. She had promised that it was actually going to be compliant with the Constitution and things like that, which probably necessitated at some point a little bit of softening of the rhetoric. So obviously, we haven't seen text of the bill yet. We haven't seen even a draft or anything like that. But I would say early indications are that she has softened her stance just a little bit on this.
So Smith has talked a lot about unifying the party, being a big tent party, similar to what the federal Conservatives have talked about in the past. But what's going to become of Brian Jean and Travis Taves now that they lost the leadership to Danielle Smith?
Yeah, another really good question. The question for sure with Travis Taves is whether or not he's going to stick around. He did not commit to sticking around if he lost when he was asked during the leadership race. There hasn't been an indication yet of what his decision is. I suspect Brian Jean is sticking around. I suspect we will see him in cabinet in a couple weeks here when cabinet is finally announced. Likely similar for some of the other folks who ran against Danielle Smith, Rebecca Schultz and Rajan Sani, the two that leap immediately to mind. Perhaps Todd Lowen will be in cabinet. He's certainly back in caucus. We saw him in a photo last week of the entire sort of UCP caucus, and he was in that photo. Drew Barnes, I should point out, from down your way, is not back in caucus just yet, but I suspect most of them will be sticking around. The two, I think, that we don't know what exactly is going to happen is Jason Kenney and Travis Taves.
Now, Danielle Smith does not have a seat at the legislature, Tyler, but will run in a by-election in Brooks Medicine Hat on, I think it's November the 8th. Smith was originally from Calgary. Why not run in the Calgary-Elbow riding, which was Doug Schweitzer's old riding?
Well, there's a risk, frankly, that she would lose in that riding. I think this is also Ralph Klein's old riding, if I'm not mistaken. But, there is the risk that Danielle Smith's sort of politics are a little bit too far to the right for a Calgary riding. there is the risk that the NDP run a really, really, really strong campaign. And obviously, that would be a terrible start to her time as premier if she was to lose a by-election. And she has also signaled, sort of a shift towards more rural dominance in the government and in the caucus, or sorry, in cabinet. So that might be another reason why she's choosing to run in the Medicine Hat area. But certainly that's the safest possible sort of area for her to run at the moment, I think, and that probably explains it more than anything. Not that will be all that much comfort to the folks of Calgary Elbow who won't have a representative for the next 6 months or so.
Yeah, and Smith says the Calgary Elbow riding may remain vacant until after the next election. Is this quite common when it comes to provincial politics?
No, it's not. Usually you would sort of have all these things at the same time, because 6 months is sort of a long time to not have someone in the legislature. So, from a tactical point of view, the UCP or Smith might not want to run a by-election if they're concerned about losing. The way she sort of explained this is that she spoke to the party's grassroots folks in the riding, and they want to be able to have, a proper search for a candidate, and that sort of race for nomination race. That's the word I'm looking for, nomination, and that they need time to do that. And so they're not going to call an immediate by-election there. This is atypical. There are people down there from media reports who are not very happy about this. Again, the NDP hammering away on this, saying that, this is a threat to democracy in the province. These people are not going to have a representative in the legislature. We could see that change. Maybe there will be a by-election before the next election, but I think pretty much all observers thinking this is a bit of a strange decision.
Tyler, let's circle back to what you're mentioning earlier about the rural theme when it comes to the makeup of the UCP and cabinet here. Premier Smith says her cabinet, which will be sworn in a couple of weeks, will be rural in makeup and thinking. Now, the vast majority of Albertans I know live in some of the big cities. Are the party's priorities maybe shifting somewhat?
Well, it's tough to say. I mean, I think probably yes. There's a bit of a discrepancy or disparity between the membership of the United Conservative Party and the province as a whole. And what I mean by that is that membership in the party is pretty heavily skewed towards rural and small town Alberta, whereas I think something like 80% of Albertans live in sort of large municipalities, and the vast majority of that in Edmonton and Calgary. So there was sort of this quip about the United Conservatives under Jason Kenney that the cabinet was basically full of people from Calgary. Of course, the UCP only has one MLA in Edmonton, for example, and that's Casey Madhu, the former Justice Minister, now Labour Minister, if I'm not mistaken. So there does seem to be this shift towards rural Alberta, which sort of makes sense considering the party's base, considering the support that Danielle Smith has. The risk for her, politically speaking, is that the bulk of the province's voters are not in these areas. And so what sort of support does that translate into in the next general election?
Yeah, you think they would focus a lot of their attention on Edmonton. As you said, only one MLA in our provincial capital, so why not put a lot of your focus there right now?
Sure, or even in some of the suburban and urban ridings in Calgary that are going to be these battleground ridings. I think if you sort of look at the math and assume the UCP is going to sweep small town and rural Alberta, if the UCP plays it safe and assumes the New Democrats are going to sweep Edmonton, then they really need to put their focus on some of these ridings in Calgary that are going to be tough for them to win, and a couple of ridings in Lethbridge. And it does seem like that's where the attention ought to go. But, early days, new teams are coming in, new staff coming in, new priorities. So a lot of this stuff, I think, reporters tend to show up and ask about X, Y, Z and assume that there's going to be an answer available, right there and then. But I do think we'll see some of this stuff sort of shake out in the weeks and months ahead.
Now, there's some rumors and rumblings here in Lethbridge that the UCP is going to bring forth one or even two potential star candidates to go up against Shanna Phillips, the Lethbridge West MLA. With the NDP right now. What are you hearing?
I haven't heard much about star candidates, and I think that one of the challenges for a star candidate is that until last week, we didn't know who the leader of the UCP was going to be. So finding a star, if you're a star candidate, do you want to run under Danielle Smith, or would you have preferred to run under Travis Taves or Brian Jean? I think certainly they will try and find some of these candidates. Lethbridge makes a lot of sense. I think some of these Calgary ridings make sense. Possibly a couple of ridings in the Edmonton area might make sense to catapult some of these people in for some star power. But I haven't heard much yet about who some of these people might be. And of course, the other issue here is that there's been a lot of controversy in Conservative Party circles, both federally and provincially, when leaders do bring in these star candidates and disrupt sort of the grassroots nomination process. They say, "Oh, we don't want Joe, the local shop owner. We have this great business person who's going to come in and run for us," and that's led to a lot of controversy over the years. So there is a bit of a tension there between the desire for a star candidate and what the local sort of constituency association grassroots members are wanting. So another potential little landmine for the Smith team if they decide to go about this.
Premier Smith said that Dr. Dina Hinshaw is out as our province's Chief Medical Officer of Health, and she's also vowing to restructure AHS. Tyler, what will that really look like?
Well, firing Dina Hinshaw is the sort of more straightforward of the two, I think we can say. Finding a replacement might be a little trickier, but that part of it, I think, is relatively straightforward. But, she said that she's going to restructure AHS by the end of the year, which is
Wow.
not that far away. And so, I mean, what is there to say? I think it's sort of anyone's guess how that's going to be accomplished on such a short time frame and what that's going to look like. Because, of course, the province has reorganized AHS a couple times before, going from centralized boards to decentralized to re-centralized and things like that. So we don't actually know a whole ton about what that might look like beyond some of the promises that she made in the leadership race, to clear out the board of AHS and the board of Alberta Health, for example. So those are some of the concrete things we might see. But, in terms of what that might actually look like, I just don't think we know yet, and it's very hard to imagine how that's going to happen on such a short time frame. So I think that's going to be something that reporters are watching very, very carefully, and that the New Democrats are going to be watching very, very carefully, because they would love to have a fight about healthcare. Their polling internally always shows that that's a sort of a bread and butter issue for Albertans. So that is a fight that they are certainly more than willing to take to Danielle Smith should that happen.
We're also watching quite closely the potential of decentralizing EMS dispatch so that municipalities will be given the power once again to bring in ambulances and not have to worry about the centralized, where a lot of mayors, including our mayor here in Lethbridge, is quite concerned about the time it's taking and the length of these ambulances to get to certain situations. What are you hearing right now in Edmonton?
Well, that's one of the strange things too, is that this leadership race was so heavily dominated by talking about COVID and talking about the Sovereignty Act that we didn't get a lot of answers about some of these things. A really similar example is the Alberta Provincial Police thing, which Danielle Smith has said she supports, but does not seem to support eliminating the RCMP entirely. And I was actually just clicking back through my emails before we had this chat, and there hasn't been any sort of policy emails or anything from the Alberta government news offices yet. So we're in sort of this void, I guess, where we actually just simply don't know what's happening on some of these fronts. So again, it should shake out in some of the weeks ahead, but it is a bit of a strange time because we simply don't have answers to a lot of these things.
Yeah, another big point too was the Alberta pension plan, opting out of the Canada pension plan, and we're going to protect Albertans' money here, and we haven't heard much of that either, have we?
No, I'm tempted to say that I think Danielle Smith supports that idea, but I don't want to say that for sure. Certainly some of the other candidates have talked favorably about that. This is a big question, to what extent is the mandate that the UCP was elected on in 2019 the mandate that Danielle Smith is still sort of following? We had the Fair Deal panel. All these policy ideas came out, including the pension plan, including the police force. They've been endorsed in that sense by the party and by the party's membership. But is Danielle Smith going to take the party down that road? Is the convention going to give us some clues, I guess, to what's going to happen? It's a very strange sort of time. And, I wasn't here for some of the last sort of strange transitions, in the Redford years and stuff like that. But to me, it's just sort of a very odd period of time.
I'm glad you brought up the conventions. Both the UCP and NDP conventions are coming up. What can we really look forward to seeing at both?
Well, I think the NDP, what we're going to be looking for is a sense of how they are going to be taking the fight to the UCP. I think healthcare is going to be a big one. I think education is going to be a big one. I think inflation is going to be a big thing that they're talking about. That's another example of something that didn't come up in the leadership as much as maybe we would have expected. These are very top of mind priorities according to all of the polling that's been done. So I think really we're going to see what the NDP's sort of attack lines are going to be. On the UCP side, I think the question is going to be just how united is this United Conservative Party? You know, the party has doubled in size in the past 6 months. You have a lot of new members who've never been involved in party politics before. A lot of them are Danielle Smith supporters. A lot of them, I think it's fair to say, tack a little bit further to the political right than some of the sort of legacy members of the party, particularly from the progressive conservative days. So, you know, I'm going to be looking quite carefully at what the policy resolutions are. And there's also usually elections at the convention for board memberships and things like that. And there was an attempt at the last one from the people who wanted Jason Kenney gone. They tried to take over the party board in these elections, and they failed, actually. So I expect that we'll see maybe a house cleaning, maybe not. Maybe these mainstream progressive conservative types that have been around for a long time are still going to hold on to some of these key positions, or maybe they won't. So I think what everyone's going to be looking for at this convention is just where this party is going, just how these new members are being folded into the party, what direction it's going to take. And for the NDP, I think it's very much just sort of they're going to rally behind Rachel Notley. They're going to hash out their battle lines. They are, I suspect, going to move a little bit to the center on some policy ideas to be a little more palatable, perhaps, to some of those Calgary voters we talked about earlier. Lots to watch, and they're in different places. I think the NDP are in Calgary and the UCP is in Edmonton, and so I wish I could be in two places at once, that's for sure.
And when are they taking place?
I believe it's the weekend of the 21st, 22nd, 23rd, so that's like less than 2 weeks away, I think.
Yeah, just around the corner. He's the Alberta correspondent for the National Post and our legislative reporter, Tyler Dawson. Thanks so much for joining us today from Edmonton.
Always a pleasure, Hal.